According to a legend passed down by the Cherokee people, the animals lived in the sky vault above the rainbow. It was very crowded. Finally, someone asked what was below the ocean that they could see from their home in the sky. They sent the water beetle to skim the surface of the water. He could not find any solid ground. So he dove to the bottom of the ocean and brought up some mud. The mud magically spread out in all four directions and became this island which we call Earth. Someone powerful then fastened it to the sky with giant ropes. All of the animals were eager to live on this new land, but they found it was too wet and soft. Finally, they sent Grandfather Buzzard down to see if the mud had hardened. He flew low over the earth, which was still very soft. When he reached the Cherokee country, he was tired, and his giant wings began to flap and strike the earth, and a valley was created. When he swept them up again, they made a mountain. The animals, afraid that the whole world would be mountainous, made Grandfather Buzzard come back. But that is why there are so many mountains in the heart of the Cherokee land to this very day. The great and powerful Cherokee nation that for hundreds of years had occupied most of the southeastern portion of the United States, by 1819 had been reduced to just parts of Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina through land ceding treaties with the federal government. The white settlers continued to ignore the terms of these treaties. The Chattahoochee River, or River of Painted Rocks, was the southern boundary of the Cherokee territory in this area that one day would become the town of Roswell. White men who lived south of the Chattahoochee River started planting crops on its northern shore. The Cherokees, trying desperately to resist the constant threat to their homeland, realized that their only chance for survival as a people would be to imitate the lifestyle of the white settlers. As their land decreased, they relied less on the once boundless hunting grounds and built more permanent homesteads and farms. By the 19th century, the Cherokees were primarily farmers. Some, like Chief James Vann, even owned vast plantations and slaves. Others were mill and ferry owners. James Dorris owned hundreds of acres of land in the Crabapple area and married Nancy Cook, a Cherokee. They operated a store there that served Indians as well as whites. The Cherokees adopted a distinctive style of dress, which combined their traditional deerskins with turbans and hunting shirts fashioned from bright European fabrics. They were the first Native Americans to use a written form of their language. Sequoyah labored 12 years to develop the Cherokee alphabet, isolating the 86 different sounds of the Cherokee language and assigning each a symbol. In 1825, the Cherokee National Legislature adopted a resolution that established New Echota as the capital of the Cherokee Nation. They created a national newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, that was written in both English and Cherokee. To provide further security for their homeland, the Cherokees discarded their traditional clan system of ruling a tribe and adopted a republican government with written laws similar to that of the United States. John Ross was their principal chief. The state of Georgia, however, was not willing to accept an independent Cherokee nation within its borders. It continued to push the federal government to make good on a promise given to them in 1802 to remove all Native Americans to land west of the Mississippi. The discovery of gold on Cherokee land in 1828 seemed to be the final event that led the state of Georgia to take matters into its own hands. The popular song of the day became, "All I ask in this creation is a pretty little wife and a big plantation. Way up yonder in the Cherokee Nation, prospectors poured into the area." The state of Georgia, tired of waiting for action by the federal government, declared the Cherokee Nation illegal, divided the land into counties, and held a land lottery, giving the land to white settlers. The Cherokees fought back through the federal courts. The Supreme Court ruled in their favor. However, President Andrew Jackson ignored this ruling, and in doing so, gave his approval for the removal of the Cherokee people. It was during this time that Roswell King sold his home in Darien and relocated to the gold mining town of Auraria to speculate in the gold fields. During his travels, King ventured into the area where Vickery Creek flows into the Chattahoochee River. An astute businessman, King was aware of the fact that the surging creek waters were capable of providing power to textile mills. In 1835, a treaty signed by a small faction of the Cherokee leaders in which the Cherokees agreed to give up all their land in Georgia and move to land west of the Mississippi River would remove the final barriers for opportunities like those sought after by Roswell King. Private John G. Burnett of the United States Cavalry, assigned to the removal of the Cherokees, described the events he witnessed. I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at the bayonet point into the stockades. And in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started toward the west. Guarded by soldiers, the people of the Cherokee Nation left behind their ancestral lands and traveled west over the trail on which they cried, or simply known today as the Trail of Tears. Many died of illness, exposure, and lack of necessary supplies, and were buried along the route. Zeke Proctor was the son of William Proctor, a Cherokee. The Proctors lived on a farm between the forks of Foe Killer Creek and Vickery Creek. He was only 7 years old when his family was forcefully removed in 1838. Roswell King returned to the area during the Cherokees' removal and began to purchase land from the original land lottery owners. With the help of his son Barrington, Roswell King was to create a textile manufacturing center, a first of its kind in the county. An earth-filled dam of rocks and logs was built to provide power to the mills. Water raced from the reservoir formed by the dam down a wooden flume. A vertical overshot water wheel located at the end of the raceway turned the gears that would in turn power the machinery in the mill. The first cotton mill was completed by 1839, with a second cotton mill to be added later, further upstream. Barrington King became the first president of the Roswell Manufacturing Company, which provided cotton not only in Georgia, but to other states as well. News of the developing town of Roswell drew settlers from neighboring states. Many came as farmers and shopkeepers. It would be the mills, however, that would become the main attraction for those who came to better their condition. Many who were unsuccessful farmers or gold prospectors came in search of a more predictable way of life associated with being a mill hand. The hours were long and the pay was poor. Factory hands worked 11 hours a day, 5 days a week, and a half day on Saturday. For this, they would receive as little as $8 a month. The conditions inside the mills were at times unhealthy and dangerous. The stifling humidity necessary for the processing of the cotton yarn created an environment like a steam bath. Many of the workers suffered from respiratory illnesses from the constant breathing of lint fibers. Fingers and arms were often broken or mangled by the rapidly moving parts of the machinery. It was not uncommon for several generations of the same family to be employed at the mill. Studies came second, when there was money to be made to help support the family as a doffer or a spinner. Roswell King built the bricks, apartment buildings for the workers at the Roswell Manufacturing Company, providing them a place to live as well as to work. Oftentimes, instead of being paid in cash, the mill workers received credit at the company's store. The commissary or general store was located at the top of the factory hill. With the promise of a regular salary and a place to live, mill workers often traded their free-spirited independence for the patriarchal structure provided by the owner of the mill village. For those employed by the Roswell Manufacturing Company, hard work was encouraged and drinking strictly forbidden. With his manufacturing center in place, Roswell King also concentrated on other aspects of his planned community, which was modeled after a New England village with a common green that separated the business district from the residences of the wealthier families. Land donated by the Kings was designated to be used as a town square. Roswell invited other family members and friends to join him in establishing the town, investing in the mills, and forming the colony. According to Henry Merrill, assistant agent to Barrington King at the Roswell Manufacturing Company, whose accounts and sketches have supplied details of early life in Roswell, the following reason was stated for the founding of the city. The idea of the colony was to have a summer resort of their own, entirely under Presbyterian influence and in a healthy mountainous location, to which they could retire during the sickly seasons, and at the same time have the advantages of schools and public worship. Abundance of land, ownership in the mills, or healthy climate. Whatever the initial reason was for the enterprise, the colonists came to appreciate their new lives on the frontier in Georgia and remained year-round. Roswell King built a double-log cabin known as the Castle to serve as a temporary residence while the mansions were being built. Primrose Cottage, built in 1839, was the first permanent residence to be completed in the Roswell colony. It was built for Eliza King Hand, widowed daughter of Roswell King, who moved to the area with her 3 children to be near her family and to invest in the mills. Roswell King left his log cabin and came to live his remaining years at Primrose. It was in the parlor of Primrose Cottage that the Roswell Presbyterian Church was organized in 1839 with 15 charter members. The Reverend Nathaniel Pratt served as its pastor from 1840 until his death in 1879. Roswell Presbyterian Church was constructed in 1840. Designed by a Connecticut architect, Willis Ball, the building is a fine example of Greek Revival architecture. The large iron bell was a gift from a Presbyterian congregation of Savannah. Reverend Pratt built the brick mansion Great Oaks for his wife, Catherine Barrington King, daughter of Roswell King. Construction details of Great Oaks include solid masonry walls that are 18 inches thick and a unique good morning staircase. Barrington Hall was the home of Barrington King, his wife Catherine Nephew, and their children. The style of the mansion is Greek Revival, with 14 Doric columns extending across the front and down the sides, and was designed by Willis Ball. Bullock Hall was built for Major James Stevens Bullock, a prominent banker from Savannah and a friend of Roswell King. The house, completed in 1840, with its pedimented portico and columns, is considered to be a fine example of the pure temple form of Greek Revival architecture. On December 22, 1853, in the dining room of Bullock Hall, Major Bullock's daughter, Mittie, married Theodore Roosevelt of New York. They were to become the parents of a son, Theodore, the 26th President of the United States. President Roosevelt made a brief visit to Roswell to visit the girlhood home of his mother while on a tour of the southern states in October 1905. Dunwoody Hall, later known as Mimosa Hall, was built in 1842 for the family of John Dunwoody. His wife Jane was a sister of Major James Stevens Bullock, and their grant of land bordered that of the Bullocks. Originally built of wood, on the night of the housewarming party, a piece of lumber lodged in one of the chimneys caught fire and the house burned to the ground. It was rebuilt with brick, stuccoed over and scored to resemble stone. Holly Hill was designed as a summer home for Robert Adams Lewis, a Savannah businessman, and his wife Catherine, who was the niece of Roswell King. Its raised cottage design was popular on the coast. Archibald Smith and his wife Anne McGill were also members of the colony. Their home was completed in 1845. The Smith property included barns, carriage house, detached kitchen, spring house, smokehouse, and slave quarters. With his 400-acre plantation, large cotton warehouse, and 33 slaves, Archibald Smith provided much of the cotton for the Roswell mills. Enslaved African Americans brought from the coast to Roswell would enable the early white settlers to maintain their economic status and the refined lifestyle so typical of the antebellum South. It was by their labors that the mills were supplied with the necessary cotton. They were the invisible hands that built the factories and stately mansions, tended the fields, and served their masters' households. Slaves were included as a part of their master's inventory, and as such were bought and sold. On the eve of the Civil War, Georgia had more black slaves than any other southern state except Virginia. The majority of the enslaved blacks worked in the fields. They worked from sunrise to sunset, backs bent under the weight of the heavy sacks. Fingers were often raw and bleeding from the brittle cotton plants. They usually lived away from their master's house. House servants were generally much better off than field hands and had more interaction with the family. At the Archibald Smith plantation, slaves performing domestic tasks lived close to the big house. Mom Grace and Charles tended to the daily needs of the Bullock family. The skilled artisans among the slaves, such as blacksmiths, masons, carpenters, and cabinet makers, were highly valued for their work. This cabinet was made by an African-American slave for Eliza Hand. Although it was illegal to teach slaves to read, Reverend Pratt educated 2 enslaved boys, gave them his name, and set them free. Charles Pratt became a Presbyterian missionary to Africa. George Pratt was an expert cabinet maker. The slaves were, at first, members of their masters' churches. Lebanon Baptist and Roswell Presbyterian accepted them as full members. But it was not long before they established their own congregations. In 1855, black members of the Lebanon Baptist Church secured land on Rock Mill Road and organized the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. Possessing no other social or political rights, the enslaved African Americans made their churches a refuge from their daily life of servitude and a place where self-expression was encouraged. In their hymns or spirituals, black slaves expressed a hope in the future, when freedom would come in their lifetime or after death. Land was also set aside for a cemetery near the original church site. Established in 1855, this cemetery was used as a burial ground for members of the African American community of Pleasant Hill Baptist, as well as for those members of Zion Baptist Church, a congregation that was organized in 1871. The first school in Roswell was called the Academy and was operated as a free school by the Roswell Presbyterian Church. The church operated the academy until the late 1870s, at which time it was deeded over to the town of Roswell. The town's first burial ground, Founders Cemetery, overlooked the mills and Vickery Creek. In 1841, an outbreak of scarlet fever caused the death of many of the early settlers' children. Roswell King was buried there in 1844. Unmarked graves are believed to be those of mill workers and African-American slaves. The mills were very profitable during those early years. Barrington King's oldest sons built a woolen mill called Ivy Mill near the Chattahoochee River. The existing cotton mills were expanded and a flour mill was in operation. By 1855, 300 operatives would produce cloth, yarn, and cotton rope for the market. Life in Roswell for the colonists during the early years was, for the most part, filled with economic success and social pleasures. They had brought with them all of the comforts of the Low Country and cherished enjoyable times among the warmth and affection of their families and friends. This peaceful way of life was shattered in 1861 when the nation was torn apart by the Civil War over issues such as slavery and states' rights. As the news of the secession of Georgia reached Roswell, the men of the village formed the Roswell Guard and marched off to battlefields far away from their loved ones. The nation would endure 3 long years of war before the fighting would take place in Georgia. But in 1864, Union General William T. Sherman vowed to make Georgia howl. By May of 1864, reports of the advance of Sherman's army towards Roswell were being heard. The wealthy families fled the area seeking refuge with friends and relatives in other parts of the state. The Confederate forces abandoned Roswell to fortify their positions further south and burned the bridge behind them to slow the Union advances. The mill workers remained behind, making supplies of rope, cotton duck cloth for tents, and woolen material for the Army of the Confederate States of America. General Sherman ordered Brigadier General Kenner Garrard to take Roswell, for it had one of the few bridges over the Chattahoochee River, a broad, shallow ford, and mills filling orders for the Confederate Army. On July 5, 1864, Union soldiers invaded Roswell. The Roswell Presbyterian Church was used as a hospital for Union soldiers. The pews were torn out and the pipe organ was destroyed. The soldiers drew a checkerboard on a cabinet door. Sherman, upon hearing that the mills were supporting the Confederate cause, ordered the arrest of the operatives. Arrest all people, male and female, connected with these factories, no matter what the clamor, and let them foot it under guard to Marietta, whence I will send them by cars to the north. Women and children, taking only the possessions that they could carry, were rounded up and held at the square before being transported by wagon to Marietta. After being held at the Georgia Military Institute, the mill workers were then loaded on troop trains, shipped up north, and released at points in Kentucky and Indiana. The mills were ordered to be burned. The mansions were spared. With the destruction of Roswell completed, the Union soldiers turned their advances towards Atlanta. Dismantling the Lebanon Baptist Church, they used the lumber to rebuild the bridge over the Chattahoochee River. Soldiers, with their supplies carried over their heads, waded across the river at the shallow ford and marched on to Atlanta. After a fierce battle, Atlanta fell to Union forces on September 2nd, 1864. On November 16, 1864, Sherman set out across the state on his march to the sea. His army formed two columns which destroyed everything in its path. In December, the city of Savannah was captured and presented by General Sherman to Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The war in Georgia was over. In the spring of 1865, Confederate forces under the leadership of Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War and the Southern way of life, as it had been known, came to an end. Barrington King wrote of his return to Roswell, "Thank God, on arrival home, I was amazed to find the mansion so little injured. We examined the wreck of the mill property. The foundation for the mill is good. We concluded to go to work to make another start." The mills were rebuilt. Factory workers were once again employed. Freed blacks worked as domestics, mill hands, or skilled laborers. Some remained on their employer's property. Others created their own little neighborhoods near the mill. African Americans had won their freedom, but would have to endure another century before gaining their rights. In the 1880s, Roswell struggled to recapture the prosperity and growth of those early years. A third cotton mill was built in 1882. Businessmen encouraged the construction of a railroad line to the city. Old Buck, with its engineer Ike Roberts, ran between Roswell and Chamblee, where cargo and passengers could make connections to Atlanta and points beyond. Canton Street emerged as a thriving business district thanks to the development of the area by Charles Jefferson Perry. In the early 1900s, however, the town would see the closing of the woolen mills. Old Buck received competition from a new motorized vehicle, the automobile. By the 1920s and 30s, Roswell would once again see hard times, with the destruction of the cotton plants by the boll weevil, declining cotton prices, the destruction of the early mill, and the end of rail service. During the Depression, the last mill operated sporadically. The following decades defined Roswell as a small southern town of farmers, merchants, and mill workers. In 1975, the Southern Manufacturing Company closed its doors for the final time. Roswell was no longer a mill town. It remains, however, one of the most significant textile industrial sites in Georgia that bears witness to over 135 years of mill history. The focus of Roswell now has changed from a manufacturing center to a suburban community that will be challenged well into the 21st century with the reality of tremendous growth. For some of the earliest inhabitants, only the names have remained. For others, a rich heritage continues to be preserved. For future generations, through the efforts of preservation, the city of Roswell will continue to bear witness to its 19th century origins by a group of colonists with a vision.